or toll free 1-866-820-KLAV. Now, let's get right. Here's your host, James Kelly.
Hello and welcome to Aspects of Writing here on KLAV. I'm your host, James Kelly. On your computer, you can listen to this broadcast live at KLAV1230am.com. We're also broadcasting live on youtube.com/Aspects of Writing. The topic of today's show is writing from life's experiences, which we've talked about this before, but many of our authors do. Our guests for today's show are authors Judy Logan and Pete Klismet. Judy is the author of Shelter Me, and Pete his newest release is FBI Diary, Profiles of Evil. But before we get with our authors, we would like to go into a portion of the show we call Fun Facts, and here's a few fun facts and quotes. And we're going to start with Judy.
A little talent is a good thing to have if you want to be a writer, but the only real requirement is the ability to remember every scar.
Stephen King. And Jen?
I'm not what happened to me. I'm what I chose to become. C.J. Young.
Okay, and Pete?
Life is a tapestry woven by the decisions we make. Sherilyn Kenyon.
All right. And Dana.
Hi, I'm glad that I paid so little attention to good advice. Had I abided by it, I might have been saved from some of my most valuable mistakes. And the same sentence.
Oh, that one's
great.
Like that.
That's a good one.
Yep. And life is a succession of lessons which must be lived to be understood. Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you are just tuning in, you're listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly, here on KLAV, along with my co-hosts, Dana Micheli and Janet Coursey. On your computer, you can listen to this broadcast live at KLAV1230am.com. Our guests for today's shows are authors Judy Logan and Pete Klismet. But before we get to know a little more about our guests, let's go over to Janet Coursey for a new segment on the show called Jan's Review. Jan, what do you have for us today?
Well, I just finished reading The Sky Buries All Sorrow, a novel by Roger de Blanc. It was magnificent. This book had me hook, line, and sinker. It is truly an extraordinary, heartfelt story. I had a difficult time remembering that it's strictly fiction. The story includes events that transpire in recent history, starting with Pearl Harbor and taking us all the way to the events of 9/11. His characters are completely believable, as if they're a part of our own friends and families. De Blanc's ingenious way with words places readers right in the middle of the action. He makes your heart pound, causes you to sit up in anticipation, and then relax when the situation is resolved. This is the first many sentences that open your eyes and bring you into the action. I quote, "When the sky dawned red for the second day in a row, the magnitude of the horror set in again." Mr. de Blanc involves the reader so that no one escapes the pain, the terror, or the disgust. You are right there with the main character, John Cooper. His story of love are tender and true to life, whether it's a young couple in love, the love of a parent for their child, a child for the parent, or the love depicted for the men, or depicted by the men for each other during the trials of war, trusting and knowing that they had each other's backs. Roger de Blanc looks deep into the souls of his character and expresses their being in words that are almost magical. This novel offers its reader everything you could want in a story: love, hate, turmoil, pity, blame, and innocence. I really enjoyed this book. This book will also give you hope all the way to the end. Yet on the other hand, you can hardly wait for I've lost my place. I am so sorry. This book will have you hoping it won't end. Yet on the other hand, you can hardly wait to discover the outcome. I absolutely give this a 5-star, would give it 10 if I could. The Sky Buries All Sorrow is available on Amazon.com and locally at Barnes & Noble in Henderson. Again, that's Roger de Blanc. Magnificent book.
And, you know, we've had Roger on a couple times,
yes,
actually, before he wrote this. So, and he's done quite a few reviews for us as well.
Yes.
So. All right, you are listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly, here on KLAV, and my co-hosts are Dana Micheli and Janet Coursey. In the studio with us today, we have Judy Logan and Pete Klismet. Again, you can listen to this broadcast live on your computer at KLAV1230am.com. Our first guest is Pete Klismet. Pete Klismet's path to becoming an author began when he joined the U.S. Navy. He was a crewman aboard submarines for 4 years and completed 2 tours in Vietnam. Following his military service, Pete enrolled in the criminal justice program at Metropolitan State College in Denver, Colorado, where he received his bachelor's degree in criminal justice and minor in psychology and sociology. After graduation, he was hired by the Ventura, California Police Department. It was a great city to live and learn the ropes of local law enforcement, he says. He remained with the police department for over 9 years, working patrol, detectives, and patrol sergeant, vice and narcotics administration. During his time with the police department, Pete continued to educate, receiving a master's degree in criminal justice from California Lutheran University and a second master's degree in public administration from the University of Southern California. After completing the FBI Academy, Pete was assigned to the Los Angeles FBI office for 2 years and assigned to the and then received a transfer to the FBI Omaha division. He was assigned to the Cedar Rapids resident agency for 11 years, where he worked general criminal assignments, interstate crime, bank robberies, drugs, etc. It was during his time in Cedar Rapids that Pete was selected from all agents in the Omaha division to be one of the original profilers for the FBI in 1985. In addition to regular investigative responsibilities, Pete was the profiling coordinator for the Omaha division, which encompassed Iowa and Nebraska. Pete worked extensively with agencies in the Midwest on violent crimes cases, in addition to training violent crime cases, in addition to training hundreds of officers in the newly implemented psychological profiling program. Pete eventually transferred to the Grand Junction resident agency of the Denver division, where he retired in December of 1999 after 20 years of service in the FBI. Prior to his retirement, Pete was named in the 1999 National Law Enforcement Officer of the Year by International organization as a result of solving multi-million-dollar multinational fraud cases. He has since taught advanced criminal investigation and criminal personality profiling classes as a professor of criminal justice at colleges in Colorado. And now Pete Klismet is an author. Pete, please tell us a little more about yourself, if you can, and about the FBI Diary Profiles of Evil.
I think I almost put myself to sleep there writing that, James, but
what a resume.
I sat there figuring out how many ways he can help me with book number 3.
And I was listening to Jan, and I was thinking about ways she could help me with book number 4. She really wrote that pretty well. But
that's a rewrite.
Yeah. Well, every book is unique, and certainly the one that Jan talked about, which I hadn't heard about, is obviously unique, and I'll get my little hands on one day. But my book, FBI Diary Profiles of Evil, is unique in the sense that never before has anyone actually gone inside the training of what profilers receive. Everybody's familiar with the show on TV, Criminal Minds,
right?
And ostensibly that's a real show. It is a real show, but does it depict what the profiling program is like? The answer to that is not really. But the point is, those guys just didn't drop out of the sky one day and they become profilers. So what the book does is goes into what actually we received as training back at the FBI Academy in profiling. Then, once you get the training, which was extensive, gory, grim, and I've described it as probably the worst thing I ever went through, then after that was all said and done, after several weeks, what do you do with that training? And so then I take it out into the field, and the end of the book goes into about, the last third of the book, I should say, goes into about about 6 different cases where we applied the technique of profiling in order to assist law enforcement with solving the cases. So that's kind of the essence of FBI Diary Profiles of Evil. It's been reviewed on Amazon very nicely. I've been very pleased with that, and so that's pretty much what it's about.
Where did the name Profiles of Evil come from?
That's
crimes,
exactly. That's a very good question. There's a particular case in there that when I was writing the book, it's a case involving a 20-year-old airman at Offutt Air Force Base in south of Omaha, who kidnapped a 13-year-old boy, took him out, brutally killed him, and kidnapped a 14-year-old boy about a month or two later, took him out and killed him as well. And as I'm writing this, I'm thinking, I'm not really sure what else would exemplify evil other than something like that. And so the word struck me, and then as a consequence, that's where the name of the book came from.
And Dan, you have questions for Pete?
Yeah, Pete, this book sounds amazing, but I was wondering what the publishing process was like for you, and who published your book.
Well, it's published by Houdini Publishing in Las Vegas, right down the street here, Dean Martin Drive. And what was the publishing process like? Well, I guess when everybody goes through their first book, and this was mine, it's, you're a new author and you're anxious to get your book out there. And so it was a struggle. It wasn't one of the easier things I've ever done in my life, but having been in law enforcement for 30 years, if I learned nothing else, it was persistence, I guess, and just stick with it, and somehow it will all magically get done. And it did, and fortunately last year it was released at the same time of the conference, Public Safety Writers Association Conference, which is the national organization here in Las Vegas. And it was awarded second prize in the nonfiction category for all the books that were submitted. So, yeah, so I was pretty pleased about that.
No kidding. So now we understand that you got another book that you want me to help you with. What's the plan with that?
Well, I actually have more than that, Jen. Dean asked about the publishing process, and all of you that are published authors know it can make you nuts.
You have to be nuts to start.
Yeah, my second book actually was, I thought, due out this week before the conference, which is why I was here this week. Well, it turned out my publisher didn't think he liked the cover that was on it, so it's probably going to be coming out here in a couple weeks, and that one's called FBI Animal House, which is a very interesting title, but then the third book is what I'm working on right now. I've got 65,000 words done, about 34 chapters, I would say, and that's going to be back to the FBI Diary series, which is FBI Diary Homegrown Terror is the name of that one. Yeah, so, and there's still a few left up. In fact, it's kind of crowded up in my head. I really need to get some of these books out of there.
I think we all think that way as writers.
No doubt, yeah.
So we already discussed the fact you have more books in the making. We know that for sure. Yep. Where can we learn more about your books?
Well, I have a website, which is www, of course, criminalprofilingassociates.com, and the book information is on there, where to obtain it. It's published by Houdini Publishing, so that's www.houdinipublishing.com, which is really the easiest place to get it, or through Amazon, and should be on Barnes & Noble here within a matter of days, weeks, or something. I don't know. So it's available, and then FBI Animal House will be similarly available here, I'm going to say, within the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay. All right. And you're going to stick around. We're going to talk to you further after we interview Judy.
I will.
All right. You're listening to Aspects of Writing here on KLAV. It's KLAV1230am.com on your computer. Judy Shine Logan has been on our show before. She lives right here in Las Vegas. And Judy has 5 short stories in addition to her novel Shelter Me, which is her latest work. Where did you get the idea for this book, Judy?
Well, it's interesting, James. It was a culmination of 2 different things. One was a pivotal conversation with my grandmother, because she lost her husband at 42 years of age, leaving her with 7 children, and yet she pined for her husband till the day she died at 86. And I thought, wow, that's some kind of love. And then the fact that I worked in psych and saw all these battered women and children, and I'm thinking, what the heck is that about? How can these people be battered by someone who says they love them, and yet there's this poor widow who'd give anything for her husband to be back? And I thought, I wonder what would happen if you put those 2 kinds of women, those 2 scenarios together. So the book becomes a recently widowed executive's wife who's got to get her first job at 55 with no job skills, and a young battered wife and mother who becomes her supervisor.
Well, okay. And I know, Jen, you've read the book.
I read the book. I love the book. And it was so funny because Judy and I actually have laughed about this. I did not know Judy at the time she wrote her book. She did not know me at the time I wrote mine. Our principal characters are as identical as if they were sisters. It's just bizarre. I know. And then other people down the road also were the same as from my book into Judy's book. It was just so I loved her book because she loved my book, and that's the way it works.
and I think when you tap into a universal truth, you know, you find, I mean, there are only so many types, and you know, your work excluded, of course. But there are only, don't profile me. There are only so many templates, if you will. You know, how people choose to use their life circumstances. So a widow's a widow. A battered woman is a battered woman. You're going to have similarities. So I think Jan and I both captured some of that universal truth.
Yeah.
Okay. And Dana, you have questions for Judy?
Yes, Judy, I know you've been published, and I'm always fascinated by this because I help a lot of clients with the publishing process.
Yes.
How did you go about finding your publisher, and what was that experience like for you?
Well, you know, it's funny, Dana. You and I have talked offline, too. I say this book was an overnight success. It only took 24 years to get it published. However, I did get involved when I came out here to Vegas. I got involved with several writers groups. Actually, the Henderson Writers Group is a very important group to me. And it's through the conference that they sponsor, the Las Vegas Writers Group, that I pitched to a publisher, and she picked up my book. So, yep, very pleased.
What was it like to write from your own perspective?
You know, I had to stop and think, there are a few people I need to wait till they die before I put this book out. Because as I looked back, I began to realize that an awful lot of women in my mother's generation were battered. Even though they were not beaten or they were not necessarily imprisoned, they were really oppressed and pushed down. And I thought, wow, that's not something women would take today. And so I thought, you know, I don't want Mama to feel badly thinking I'm talking about, you know, our family. I don't want a girlfriend who is a battered woman to think I'm talking about her. So it was a little bit touchy for me to write the battered piece. The widow, that became up close and personal when I became a widow. It suddenly smacked me in the gut. And I said, I can write this a little deeper now. So it was difficult.
I'm just curious, did your friend read this book, the one who was battered?
Yes. And she said she cried for a week. And then she went back to therapy. She said because what happened essentially was, not to be gross, but it pulled the scab off the scar, and, you know, more pus came out.
So, good analogy.
Yeah.
Where can we learn more about your book?
My book is on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. It's a Kindle version and print. And I also have a website, JudyShineLogan.com.
Okay. And you were published by Ink and Quill?
Ink and Quill in Henderson, Nevada. Yep. Joe Wilkins and Maxwell Drake.
Yeah, I know. Know both. Dana, we're going to go to a segment called Dana's 2 cents worth. Dana, what do you think of what we're talking about today?
Well, I just think, I mean, the best books I've read are written from personal experience. And our two guests today, it's just amazing the difference in the material they bring to the world. I mean, it's like they're giving part of themselves to the world, and I just think it's such an important gift to give people if you have a story to tell. You know, I think there's a temptation to write about something, to write the great American novel and make it this grandiose thing that you think it should be, when the story is usually much closer to home than that. So I think you guys are kind of ahead of the game in writing things that you really live through. I think it makes it that much more real, you know?
Yeah, it's true. Thank you, Dean.
Yeah. Well, what was the experience like for you, Pete, in writing from what you know? I'm just curious.
That's an interesting question.
Because you took a big twist in, you know, your vocation as far as going from profiler to author.
Yeah, but it was sort of a logical progression in that I had always thought that I would like to write, and I was somewhat self-disciplined in the sense that during the course of time I was in the FBI, I wouldn't keep a diary so much as, maybe every 6 months I would discipline myself to try to sit down and say, okay, now what's happened to me over the 6 months that have, been particularly unique, interesting. And so I kept those notes and put them in a file. And so I've been dragging that file around for the last 20 years. And even now, if I'm writing on the other book I'm working on now, I will have some other recollection of something, and I'll write it down. I always keep a piece of paper available to me out in the garage and sit down and I'll write something out and then take it inside and put that in the file too. So the file's getting kind of fat, but when the time comes, then all of that information is there and recorded. And so I've had a lot of people ask me, well, Pete, when are you going to write a fiction book? You probably have a great background to write, a book of fiction. And I guess my answer to that is, I don't know if I would ever know how to write fiction. I really admire people that do write fiction in the sense that they have to come up with all these ideas that I've already made notes of.
Right.
And they're, the truth is literally stranger than fiction. Yeah. And that is, I think, exemplified in FBI Diaries, or FBI Diary Profiles of Evil. Just some of the things you can't even begin to imagine happened, and they happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Judy, your experience with the writing, I know, deals with psychology, because that's what you do.
Yep.
When you were developing these characters, because you have more than just the one character, where did they come from? What brought them to life?
Well, as I say, my grandmother, she was the matriarch, old Irish scrub woman, literally raised her kids on her knees, scrubbing floors and going to mass every day. And so she was, the epitome of someone who loved deeply and profoundly and forever.
Mm-hmm.
So she became Anne in my book, and even though Anne is married or was married to an executive, that only sets her up to be even more vulnerable in the workplace, because she has lots of experience volunteering, but she has no experience working. And in the book I say something about she's interviewing with a guy, and he said, "My dear, the difference between volunteering and working is the difference between being conscripted into the army and showing up for tea."
Ooh.
So, there is a whole different dynamic of having to work for a living, and you don't have any skills, you have no negotiation power. So she has to go in on the ground level and take a lot of stuff from people, a lot of abuse, and she's very insecure, in spite of the fact that she was once an executive's wife, which had its own sort of status. So the only thing that makes her and my grandmother the same is their profound love for their husband that they never let go. And the Battered Women is a composite of lots of women I saw in psych. And the interesting thing is, when I first started out in psych, I was a secretary. And it wasn't until my 40s that I went back to school and got a master's degree in education and began teaching and doing some, group things, that I saw it right in the front lines. I mean, they would come to our desk and have burn marks on their arms.
Wow.
Or a split lip, and they're bleeding on our desk. And, you go, oh my God, what do I do with this? How do I purge this? How do I get these horrible images out of my head? So I'd have to go home and write it. And it was almost satisfying to write the Battering Husband. I don't know why, but it gave me a chance to get into some viciousness inside me I didn't know I had.
Well, Pete, you in a strange sort of way, your paths cross in that area.
Yes.
Absolutely cross, Jane. And you noticed me sitting here nodding my head up and down because, when people think about my background, they see the initials FBI and they forget about everything else. But I was a police officer out in Ventura, California for 10 years, and certainly dealt with a number of these situations involving domestic abuse and domestic violence. And I don't know, there was probably nothing else about my job that made me crazier than that. The notion of a man not only striking a woman, but literally beating a woman to the point where she was physically injured. And, at that point, we didn't really have any rules saying, well, the only thing we could tell the woman was, it's a misdemeanor. It did not occur in my presence, and as a consequence of that, you have to tell your husband he is under arrest, and then I can take him to jail for a misdemeanor. And that's the way the law was written then. It has since changed dramatically, certainly in California, I know in Colorado, and I'm assuming in many other states. So anyhow, it was a very precarious situation for her, because you would think, oh, okay, well, she'll tell him he's under arrest and he'll go to jail. He'll stay there for the next 114 years. And the fact of the matter is, he would be out in about 114 minutes, and then guess what? The consequences of that's going to be. So I saw that firsthand many, many times, and it really made me crazy.
Yeah.
And it really had, there were times when it really upset me greatly.
My sister is a Vietnam vet, and she went into the sheriff's department in Florida, one of the first women in the 70s, and she called me one night. She couldn't even speak. And I said, "What's the matter, Jan?" And she said, "I just had to arrest someone." And I said, "Yeah, that's what you do."
Yeah.
She goes, "I went to this house, and this woman's face was mush.
Whoa.
And her husband had beaten her. And I said, 'Please file charges so I can arrest your husband.' And she said, 'I can't. He'll get mad at me.'" And Janice looked at her and she said, "What do you think he is now?" She says, "No, he's just upset. I can make it right." And that stuck with me. And I thought, how, after someone beaten the hell out of you, how do you believe you can make it right? But they do.
Yeah, and it's something that Dana may want to pursue a little bit more, but let me just, pose a question about that too, because there's an entire, I don't know if the right word is a syndrome, but it's kind of a situation where many women get married, they don't have job skills, and you were talking about, and I made note of that, of your relative being 55 years old, when she was in the position of suddenly having to go out, join the workforce, having no skills.
Right.
And that is actually the case with many women, and that's why, a lot of people say, well, your husband punches you out, why don't you just leave?
Yeah,
well,
right.
it's not that easy to just leave.
Definitely.
Go where with what?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Leave with what? And that's the other thing. If all these pages were self-esteem and say you're holding your self-esteem, and I say, you know what, you're a jerk. You know what, you're stupid. You know what, you're fat and ugly. How much self-esteem do you have left to walk away?
None.
And for every child you have, that's 2 more legs you have to run on.
Yeah.
Oh, I hadn't
Very
looked
true,
at
good
that
point.
idea.
Well, what's interesting too, and that you're talking about this, since it's all about how your book came about in the first place, is that you're talking about not just abuse physically, but mentally.
Absolutely.
Because there was an era in our society where women really didn't work for a living.
Right.
It was considered you work at home,
Right.
without realizing they worked harder at home than they do out in the workforce.
Yeah.
And I can remember my grandmother getting up at 4 a.m, fixing my grandfather breakfast. He goes off to work. She does her daily chores, the laundry, hoeing the garden, doing all these things, sewing, whatever she had to do. And then he'd come home for lunch. She'd have to have that on the table. He would leave to go back to work. She would pick up where she left off, and then repeat it again at dinner. And he would come home and say, "So what did you do today?"
Yeah. Nothing, honey. I just cooked for you. Yeah.
It is some bonbons.
Yeah.
And just watch the
So it is amazing. Abuse can be more than just physical,
Absolutely.
without a doubt.
And I do have a scene in my book where the battered wife takes her kids to the bus stop, and the other young mothers harass her and say, "Oh, you're going to work again? What are you, one of those livers?" And blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And she's working because her husband's a factory worker, and they're trying to make a middle class lifestyle. And the other mothers bash her for it. Well, if you stayed home, your husband wouldn't be so mad.
Yeah. Oddly enough, and right along that same line, Judy, I wrote what's still probably one of the most famous reports in the history of the Ventura Police Department. And it was an assault with a deadly weapon, and the classification of a weapon was a chicken fried steak.
Oh.
Now, most often you don't think of a chicken fried steak as being a deadly weapon, but in this case, the wife had come home, or the husband had come home, sat down, started complaining, ranting and raving, and apparently there was some abuse involved, in that too. So she finally got tired of listening to it. She went into the freezer, got a packet of chicken fried steak out that were totally frozen, and laid him out, whacked over the head. And I got there, and it's hard not to laugh because you know what you're dealing with. But I went ahead and wrote it up. I did not arrest her. I said, well, let the DA make that decision. And I think the DA opted not to because there was a history of abuse there. But, some things like that, you've got to have a sense of humor, although in those things and some of the types of cases I dealt with child sexual abuse, those are things that it's really hard to have a sense of humor about.
Absolutely. Well, going back to my sister's case, she, the wife refused to put the husband in jail, and so my sister said, I can't do anything for you, and she left. Husband came back with a gun. They had a struggle. The wife shot him. The wife went to prison.
Wow.
Yeah.
So.
Well, this really sets up the next part of our show. Because the whole idea behind the show is talking about writing from life's experiences. And I think we've covered that. Wow. You are listening to Aspects of Writing with me, your host, James Kelly, here on KLEV. My co-hosts are Dana Micheli and Jenna Coursey. And again, you can listen to this broadcast live at KLEV1230am.com on your computer. Our guests for today's show are Judy, Logan, and Pete Klismet. The topic of today's show is writing from life's experience. And I think both our panelists here have that.
And we're very, very passionate about it.
And I'm going to let Dana start this part of the show off.
Okay. Real life is the greatest font of unbelievable truth. It's no wonder so many writers exploit their own lives as sources of complex relationships, dramatic events, observational details, and pithy dialogue. But knowing how to weave elements of real life into a work of fiction requires some skill to maintain the ring of truth without being too slavishly literal. Writing real life experiences into a story is a great way to make it more realistic. By using life events, you are making your story or manuscript more real to the reader. The life experiences also lend an air of credibility to your writing.
I would like to talk about this for a minute because writing both your books really is a different experience in a way. Because even though yours are based on real life experiences, Judy, it is a fictional book.
Yes.
Whereas Pete, yours is based on profiling. And I think what's interesting here is Pete, you're kind of taking real life situations and putting those into your book, whereas Judy, you have to expand on yours and find a way of incorporating those without someone feeling like that's me.
Right. And actually what Pete is doing is called narrative nonfiction, so it has an element of piecing the disparate scenarios together. So in that sense, he's also crafting a book. But like you say, my book has to be embellished more. And it's different. It's different.
And Dan, did you have anything to add to this? Because I know you're an editor, so.
Kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Like if I'm editing someone's book and I can immediately tell if the person has not experienced or doesn't know firsthand what they're writing about, it leaps out at you. And sometimes it's a question of research. It could be the person's writing a crime novel and they don't know what would actually happen if the police showed up, or if someone like Pete were profiling them, but it leaps out right away, and I make a note, would this really be? You need to, research this or whatever, but it's immediately apparent when the author doesn't know what they're talking about.
True.
Even if the writing skills are there has to be some sort of knowledge base.
Absolutely, I agree. Yep.
And I'll have to admit, I greatly admire people like Judy that can actually take those life experiences and then weave them into something of a tapestry, into a book that is a fictional book, but yet your own personal life experiences, obviously, in your case, can't help but interposing themselves into the book. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that, James, to go back to your question earlier, how is it to write from your own experience? I had to be ready for people to go, oh, you poor battered woman. And I think, I wasn't battered. My husband's dead. He'll come out of the grave and kill you. But that's just a joke. But the point is, you look back and you go, oh, well, that was kind of bullyish of him to do that. And, he didn't want me to do this and that. So you start second guessing yourself. But I was not a battered woman. I would have to say probably my mother was, looking back now. But again, that was the day and age. And I have had had to tell a lot of people, no, I'm not the battered woman, but I've seen enough of it up close.
Right, you were talking about your friend.
Yeah, my
battered.
friend,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But here's the deal, Judy, and you can tell me if this is true or not, but my mother was too.
Ah.
And so I'm inclined to think that really influenced me, in dealing with these situations when I was a police officer. Now, as an FBI agent, you don't deal with that kind of stuff.
Right, right.
It's not like agents on patrol.
Yeah.
But, as a police officer, I did. And when I went to one of those things, I found it, very upsetting. And in fact, one time, shouldn't even admit this, but the statute of limitations has expired. I told the guy, come on outside, I want to talk to you for a little while. And I just told him, I said, something along the lines of, you're really bad. I mean, you can beat up your wife and you can punch her out. Why don't you take a run at me? Let's see how that would work out for you.
Good for
and
you.
So he didn't, which was a wise choice on his part.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're not a small guy. You would be mush.
No, and I almost hate to admit that, but it can be very upsetting. People say, well, you're a police officer, you're supposed to be very professional.
Right.
Yes, but you can't help but to let the things that have happened in your life influence your behaviors.
Absolutely. You're human. Yep.
Right, and all writers really write from life's experience.
Absolutely.
In one way or another.
Yep.
I think in writing our books that we find things from our past or people we've known to incorporate into those characters.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just a given.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Judy.
Go ahead. I was just going to say one quick incident, and I'm glad they're all dead now because I don't want Pete to go looking for them. There was actually a man at my dinner table who was on furlough for murder in Massachusetts when they had the furlough program, and he came to my house with a friend of a friend, and I said to him, and I'm 19 years old, I know nothing. My husband's 26, and I said, oh, what do you do for a living? I make license plates. What do you mean you make license plates? Where do you do that? In Bridgewater State Prison. Why are you in prison? Well, my wife was dating some swabby and left our 6-year-old daughter home alone, so naturally I had to go out, and I popped her, and then I popped him. And I went, you mean you killed them? And he goes, yeah, I had to do it, right? I said, more dessert?
Moving right along.
Yeah.
I don't have that kind of stuff going on in my book. Mine's more on the other side of the line, which I have no experience at whatsoever.
One of the things about doing these shows is inevitably Jen was talking about the book that she reviewed, and I'm busily writing that down. Judy's doing the same thing. I'm busily writing that down. These shows are fun to do, but they cost you money because now I got to go out and
buy these books. I think that's the whole idea, Pete.
I think so. We sell each other on our own books.
We could just swap, all right?
That's fair.
All right.
So, Pete, answer this. How much different is it to write a story based on true life as opposed to incorporating true life experiences into a fictional book? Because then your imagination could just run wild.
Well, it could, and I have one of those imaginations that probably could, and I probably have to restrain it a little bit, because even if you're writing a nonfiction type of book, your thinking processes can take you beyond that. Certainly within the realm that I'm talking about, and that was what we used to call psychological profiling, is now called criminal investigative analysis, toned it down. But your thinking processes can really run wild, and you've got to restrain that. You've got to put up a hurdle and say, no, stop, wait a minute. You don't need to go there. Just stay where you are, stay within the facts, and don't go into the fictional realm. And so that's, you do have some right, I think, as an author, of creative license, and that's okay.
Right.
I don't think any of us can, dispute that. But you don't want to go beyond the fact pattern that you find yourself dealing with, and I try real hard not to do that in any of my books.
Well, I'm just curious because you're writing on real life experiences. When oftentimes there's an exercise you can do where you tell a story or a joke, and then you tell it to the next person, you tell it to the next person, you tell it to the next person. And by the time it gets to the third or fourth person, it's a different story.
Right.
In your case, when you're telling this story, you're doing it firsthand, we know. But obviously, if time has passed, would there be things you might have to incorporate that you don't know to be fact, or embellish a little bit. Let's put it that way.
That's exactly, and you noticed me chuckling a little bit because there's a new concept, and I think it was just invented yesterday afternoon. You can correct me on this or not. Called embellishment. And so when we do tell
That
stories,
was yesterday?
wasn't it? Yeah,
You could be right. I have a short memory.
Yeah, I think I saw it on the internet that it was, but yeah, there are some of the stories that maybe you do embellish a little bit to make them perhaps a little bit more dramatic, but still, there, in the types of things that I dealt with, as I said earlier, the truth is indeed stranger than fiction.
Right.
And I had that comment from a number of people that have read FBI Diary Profiles of Evil, saying that these things couldn't possibly have happened, Pete. They had to come out of your imagination. And my answer is, I don't have that good of an imagination. So, yeah.
It's like the book Helter Skelter.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, who would have thought that was real?
Yeah.
No.
That was a book, that's an interesting point, Jen, because I was a police officer out in Ventura when that book came out. It was shortly after the Manson murders. If the listeners aren't aware of the book, it was written by Vincent Bugliosi, who was the prosecutor on the Manson murders. And I was sitting in my living room at night, probably 11 o'clock, reading the book. And it was talking about these Manson people creepy crawling through the house.
Yeah.
And there's some very tense situations in there, aside from the fact that they were killing people left and right, but very tense situations. And I'm into reading this thing, and all of a sudden, I heard a snap, a noise outside my door, and that book went in the air. I went in the air, and I went looking for my gun, and it was probably a cat, but if that cat had still been there snapping things, it probably would have weighed about 17 pounds more with lead in it. Because but if that book was so well done, it literally scared the liver out of me times. Yeah, so good point.
To me, it was more scary than Jaws.
Infinitely.
Yeah, it would definitely stick in your mind a lot more.
Yeah, because it could happen to any of us. I can remember back then our parents saying, make sure your bedroom window's closed at night and you've got something blocking it and blah, blah, blah.
Exactly.
Because they just knew that these people were everywhere out to get us all.
Yeah.
And in fact, some truth to that. I mean, in the United States, we have, believe this or not, about 16,000 murders every year.
Yeah.
And I've actually astounded a lot of people with that number, but we have about 35 murders committed in the United States every day, even as we speak. So a lot of that is true.
Yeah.
Now, Pete, you just mentioned that they've changed the name profiling to a more palatable, shall we say, or more politically correct thing. Is that because people have used profiling, to push other agendas? Negative agendas?
Yeah. That's a very good point, Judy. It actually became a matter of turf, I think, when they initially called, and I was one of the original group of profilers, and feel very fortunate to have. That's something I can write on my resume. But so we went out. We were psychological profilers. Well, the psychological community itself took great umbrage at that because most of us, including myself, I mean, I got several degrees, but none of those are in psychology.
Right.
And so they're saying, how can you psychologically profile somebody when you don't have a background, or degrees in psychology, whether that's a master's or a PhD? And so I think as a result of some political pressure from American Psychological Association, I believe that's what it is, that they decided, we better change things around here a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Interesting.
That's what caused that.
I've seen that play itself out in psych because the psychologists versus the MDs, who's the real doctor? One has a doctorate in science, one has a doctorate in medicine.
Yeah.
And there's always this turf war, which is crazy.
Yeah.
But no.
Well, here are some points you can consider before writing about real events. And number one is, how closely should my story resemble real life? Obviously, in Pete's case, it's going to resemble real life. And in Judy, how do you feel about that?
Again, I think, I'm modeled it on well, not stereotypes, but certain situations that people find themselves involved in. And there was some concern that it might be too close to home for some people, like my friend, yeah. So I worried a little bit about that.
So did that cause you to hold back, or do you feel like, no, I've got to put this in here because this actually enhances the point I'm trying to get across?
I had to put it in there. Had to put it in there.
Yeah, because I think the thing we do as authors is most of us write. We try to send a message somewhere within our work.
Exactly.
And you can't do that if you're holding back.
No.
Let me interpose something, and I'll ask this question to Judy, and that is, if your story doesn't resemble real life, would you feel like I am? I would actually feel like I'm cheating my reader if I don't give them what the true story was, and that's why I don't embellish that much. So is that being fair to your reader if it doesn't exemplify those aspects of real life?
I think my motivation for writing it was expressly to teach, was expressly to help those in those circumstances to feel validated and heard, but also to help people who say, just get up off your duff and get out, or get over it. I mean, I had one woman who read my book, and she's never been married, had long-term relationships, but she said, oh my God, all the widow did was whine through that whole book. Cry, cry, cry. Don't invite me to your next pity party. And I'm thinking, my dear, I cried for 8 years. 8 years after my husband died. All right, I'm a slow child, but that's the way it was for me. You're going to grieve as long as you grieve. So I'm on a mission to help other people to own whatever they have to own.
Yeah.
I think the difference, though, in what you write, Pete, as opposed to the way Judy writes is that no one would know whether or not she's embellished or left out anything.
Right, right.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there would be some possibility in, some of the things I was involved in that somebody could pull out that card and say, aha, you weren't telling the truth on this, so I have to be very circumspect about what I do.
Yeah. Yeah, they could definitely come back to you and say, oh, you've got your facts wrong, guy. This case didn't go this way. And
it could bite me.
Yeah, it could bite you.
I haven't been bit yet.
We've kind of covered a couple of these, but the number 3 is will people who know me or know the person I am writing about read this story? And Judy, you already said that your friend did read this story.
She did. But it was also amazing how many people, if you want to say, came out to me as battered spouses, men and women, as a result of my writing this. I got back with my high school class, and as a way of selling some books, I was amazed at how many people said, I've been in this circumstance, even men. So I think one of my next books will be about a man who's battered.
And I'm just curious, Pete, because even though yours is based on fact, do you know people who you've written about, like family members or someone who may have read this book, or that you personally know that you wrote the book? And how do they feel about it?
Well, I think every writer's unique. I think anybody that knows me could pick up a book that was a manuscript and not know that I had written it, and once they start reading it, realize that it was written by me, because even though I'm dealing with some very serious subject matter in FBI Diary Profiles of Evil, still in all, I tend to be somewhat silly and somewhat irreverent by my nature, and by that I'm not saying I make light of the situations, but you have to interpose some humor at times. At least I have to. It's almost a obligation of mine, I think.
It would be dreadful if you didn't.
It would be.
I'm just curious, so do you know of anyone that you've written about who has family members that you were thinking, what if they read this?
Right.
That's a good question, James, and I don't know. I actually have thought about that, though. I've thought about if somebody from the family read that book, would they feel that the facts were portrayed correctly? And there's a number of circumstances in there where, I felt like I had to portray the facts correctly because the family could read it, and they might take some umbrage at it. So that could happen. I have not gotten any negative calls or emails or publicity about that. So
no death threats?
Not yet. No.
Good. Thank God.
And he hadn't thought about that until now, Judy.
Really?
Shortly after the show.
Tomorrow's headline.
I'm going to have to pray over him now.
Yeah.
Starting with Mike, our board man. Should I change everyone's names? I'm pretty much certain that, Pete, you didn't put the real names in your book, did you?
I had to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because it's
All
true.
right.
This is
Because
fiction.
that is a situation where someone might pick this book up who's a family member and read this, and you just wonder what would they feel about this. I look back to Kennedy's assassination and Oswald and his children, for instance. When they read books about their fathers, what are they thinking?
Oh yeah, what a
You
dreadful
know?
thing. Yeah, from my vantage point, I mean, it's a different type of thing, James, in that those names, by and large, are already out in the public domain.
Okay.
In fact, I write about, at the very end of FBI Diary, a case involving a sexual assault and murder of a 68-year-old woman in a little town of Beatrice, Nebraska. And then the outcome of that, I actually did a profile on the case, which said it couldn't possibly have been done by more than one person. And ultimately, down the line, much to my shock, it turned out I'll say, rather incompetent investigation identified 6 people who they believed were suspects. They arrested them all. They got them all to plead guilty, except for one. He went to trial. He was convicted. Those 6 people, incredibly, served over 70 years in jail, and what they did is failed to look back and see that there was a profile in the file that said there could only be one person that committed this murder. And it's kind of like, how good were you at math? The numbers 1 and the number 6 are just a little bit different. So
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have one last question. We're going to keep it short. Would my story be better if I based it strictly on fictional characters? And Pete, that's a good question for you, because what if you'd made them fictional instead of real?
You know, the truth of the matter is, James, I'm just thinking about the new book that's going to be coming out within a couple of weeks, and that's FBI Animal House. Actually, it recreates some of the things we did back at the FBI Academy, which a lot of people would not possibly believe, in the bastion of law enforcement, the West Point of law enforcement. Just the crazy things my class did. And I actually did combine some people's personalities together and make up a few people. But still, to retain the flavor of the book, I had to do that, and I didn't want to necessarily put the onus on one person. So, yeah, it can be done, and in fact, has been done by me.
Okay. Well, we're running out of time. We're down to the last minute of the show. I'd like to thank our guests, authors Judy Logan and Pete Klismet, along with my co-hosts Janet Coursey and Dana Micheli. Our next live broadcast will be Tuesday, July 29th at 2 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on KLAV. For our future guest lineup, please visit our website at aspectsofwriting.com. Aspects of Writing broadcasts live every other Tuesday at 2 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on KLAV 1230 a.m. on the dial. On your computer, again, we are broadcasting live at KLAV1230am.com. This show rebroadcasts on VegasAllNetRadio.com every Friday at 5 p.m. Please visit our website and visit our show and date and time there. Our past shows are also archived on VegasAllNetRadio.com. To view the recorded visual version of the show, go to youtube.com/aspects of writing on computer. This show will be posted immediately after this broadcast. Until next time, this is your host, James Kelly, reminding you, if you can dream it, you can write it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes.
Great show.